Welcome to Epic HFY Stories. Before we dive into today's story, make sure to check if you've subscribed to our channel. It's completely free, and subscribing will ensure that our stories show up more often in your feed. The battlefield was still, but it was not peaceful. The twisted wreckage of ships littered the land, metal remnants jutting into the dark sky like broken skeletons of a forgotten war. Black clouds rose from the charred remains, their ominous swirl filling the air with the scent of burnt earth and the sharp sting of metal. The ground was scarred, ruined by explosions, crushed bodies, and shattered lives. There was no sound of victory here, only silence, the kind that fills your ears after destruction. Among the wreckage, a figure knelt on the cold, blood-soaked ground. Carol, a warrior of the Varani Empire, was bruised, battered, and bound. Her arms were pulled roughly behind her back, the rope cutting into her green skin. Her knees pressed into the ash, the sting of it a small pain compared to the exhaustion and fear that gripped her body. She had been trained for this, but nothing could prepare her for the bitter reality of defeat. Once proud, once fierce, she now wore the mark of a prisoner. The glow of her bright eyes was dulled by the smoke, her spirit crushed under the weight of what had happened. She had lost everything. Her people, her empire, all reduced to nothing more than dust and smoke. Behind her, a soldier stood. He was human. She could hear his breathing, slow and steady, despite the chaos around them. His footsteps were soft on the cracked ground, but she knew he was there. She braced herself. She had heard the stories of humans. They didn't take prisoners. They didn't show mercy. As she waited for death, her body tense with the anticipation of the blow that would end it all, the soldier didn't move toward her with weapon raised. Instead, there was a shift in the air, a subtle shift that she couldn't understand. The human soldier reached into a pouch at his side. There was no weapon drawn, no blade to cut her down. He pulled out a simple bottle of water and set it gently at her feet. Carol blinked, confused. She looked from the bottle to the soldier, her mind struggling to piece this strange moment together. The human didn't speak, but the gesture was clear enough. He crouched beside her, setting up a small campfire, his movements slow, deliberate. He didn't hurt her. He didn't tie her down. He didn't shout at her. He simply set down the water bottle and went about his business. "Why?" she whispered, her voice cracked from thirst and exhaustion. The soldier didn't respond at first. He just continued his task. Then, looking up at her, he answered, his voice calm and steady. "Because you look thirsty." Carol stared, her mind reeling. She couldn't make sense of it. She had prepared for the end, for the final strike that would take her life. She had prepared for the wrath of the humans, for their merciless rule. But now, faced with this simple kindness, she didn't know how to react. "Are you going to kill me?" she asked, her voice quiet, barely a whisper in the stillness. The human soldier tilted his head slightly, as if the question puzzled him. Then he shook his head. "Not today." The words hit her harder than she expected. Not today. It wasn't what she expected. It wasn't what she had been taught to believe about humans. They didn't offer second chances. They didn't show mercy. They were conquerors. But here he was, this soldier, offering something entirely different. She didn't understand it, but her instincts told her to stay still, to not provoke him. She watched him carefully, unsure of his intentions. As the sun began to set behind the crumbling ruins of the battlefield, the soldier set up a small fire. He cooked food, and though she wasn't sure if she could trust him, Carol's stomach growled in protest. The human soldier simply sat beside the fire, eating in silence. He didn't speak to her. He didn't demand anything. He just existed. "Are you mocking me?" she asked, her voice laced with distrust. He glanced up at her for a moment, then returned his gaze to the fire. "No tricks," he replied softly. "Just a second chance." Carol narrowed her eyes, the confusion building. "You're human," she said slowly. "We're enemies. Why would you give me a second chance?" The soldier poked at the fire with a stick, watching the flames flicker. His eyes were distant. "Maybe because I'm tired of killing. Maybe because I'm tired of following orders." Carol's eyes widened. He didn't act like the monsters she had been told about. The human who should have struck her down, the enemy who should have finished what had started, was offering her something she hadn't expected. Life. "You should have killed me when you had the chance," she said softly, almost to herself. The weight of it settled over her like a dark cloud. The soldier didn't respond immediately. He looked down at his hands, the quiet between them stretching long. Then, without a hint of judgment, he spoke again. "You hesitated too." Carol froze. She remembered the moment. The moment when she had aimed at him, ready to pull the trigger. But she hadn't. She had hesitated. And now, here they were. A strange silence hung in the air. Not an uncomfortable one, but one thick with unspoken words. "Strange, huh?" the soldier said, his voice low but steady. Carol didn't answer. She simply stared at the fire, lost in thought. The night was growing darker, but the fire's warmth was enough to stave off the chill. She didn't understand this human, but in that moment she realized something. Perhaps she wasn't the only one who had been forced to survive. Perhaps, just perhaps, they were more alike than she'd ever imagined. The fire crackled softly between them. The night air was still, but the heavy silence seemed to pulse with 1,000 unspoken thoughts. Carol sat a few feet from the soldier, her eyes flickering between him and the flames. The warmth from the fire did little to calm the storm of confusion swirling in her mind. Jace, the human who had spared her life, didn't look like a monster, but she couldn't let go of everything she had been taught, everything she had seen in battle. He was still the enemy, wasn't he? He wore the same uniform as the soldiers who had killed her people, who had torn apart her empire. Yet here he was, sitting with her, offering food, offering water. "Are you mocking me?" she asked again, her voice barely above a whisper. The question lingered in the air, uncertain, as if testing the truth of what she was seeing. She was so used to the bloodshed, the violence, that this calm, this quiet, was foreign. Jace didn't respond at first. He poked the fire again, watching as the flames danced in the night. Then, after a long pause, he spoke, his voice low and calm. "No tricks, just a second chance." Carol felt a tightness in her chest. The words felt heavy, filled with meaning she didn't understand. A second chance. What did that even mean? Was he offering her mercy? Or was this something else? Something darker she couldn't see yet? Her mind wandered back to the battlefield. The destruction. The bodies of her comrades. The faces of her fallen brothers and sisters. She had been prepared for this. For the end. It was what she had been trained for. The Varani Empire didn't surrender. They didn't show weakness. But here, now, she was on the receiving end of something she had never expected. Compassion. "Why are you helping me?" she asked finally, her voice edged with doubt. It wasn't the question of a soldier facing an enemy, but the question of someone who had no idea what to do with this newfound uncertainty. Jace looked at her, his eyes calm, but there was something deeper behind them. "Because I'm tired," he said simply. "Tired of fighting, of killing, of following orders like a machine." Carol felt a pang of something. Sympathy, perhaps? She couldn't remember the last time someone had spoken to her like this, without hostility, without judgment. She had never been offered a second chance. In the silence, Jace pulled out 2 small energy bars from his bag. He handed one to Carol, his eyes meeting hers for a moment. "I'm not asking you to trust me," he said, his tone steady. "But I'm not asking you to fight anymore either." Carol hesitated, eyeing the food in her hand, unsure if she could accept it. Could she trust him? Could she allow herself to believe that he was different from all the others? Slowly, cautiously, she took the bar from his hand and unwrapped it. She ate in silence, the food barely reaching her stomach. Her mind was elsewhere, somewhere between fear and disbelief. The night stretched on, and the fire burned low. The wind howled in the distance, but here, in this small corner of the ruined world, there was peace. The kind of peace that didn't make sense. Hours later, Carol shifted uncomfortably on the ground. Her hands were still tied, though she didn't feel the same overwhelming fear she had when she first knelt in the ash. The night was long, and sleep didn't come easy. Her thoughts were too loud, too chaotic. She was caught in a battle between the past, the warrior she had been, and the strange reality that was unfolding in front of her. She heard footsteps. Slow, deliberate. Jace was approaching her again. His movements were calm, his rifle slung over his shoulder. Carol's body tensed instinctively, but she didn't move. She waited. Her mind raced. Was this the moment? The moment he would take her life? But instead of pulling out a weapon, Jace knelt behind her. The sound of a knife cutting through rope echoed in the still air. Carol's eyes widened as her wrists were freed. She spun around quickly, ready to fight, to defend herself. But Jace didn't move. He simply sat back down by the fire, not threatening, not attacking. "You're free," he said softly, almost as if it were a casual statement. Carol stared at him, her heart racing in her chest. "Free? Why?" she asked, her voice trembling. Her body was exhausted, her mind spinning with the possibility that this was all some cruel trick. Jace didn't look at her. He simply stared at the fire, his face unreadable. "Because you didn't deserve to die," he said quietly. "And because I'm tired of killing people who look just as lost as I feel." Carol's breath caught in her throat. She didn't know what to say. This wasn't what she had expected. This wasn't what she had been prepared for. And yet, here she was, sitting on the cold ground, her hands finally free, with a human soldier offering her something she never thought she would get: a chance to live. The world outside their small fire seemed to vanish. The ruins, the war, the destruction, all of it felt distant, unreachable. For the first time, Carol wondered if there could be something more than the endless cycle of violence. But she didn't know if she was ready to believe it, to trust it. Still, the silence between them wasn't as heavy as it once had been. There was something here, a connection, fragile as it was, that neither of them had expected. Later that night, Carol lay awake, staring up at the starless sky, her mind racing. She couldn't sleep. Too many thoughts, too many questions. The fire beside her crackled, but it couldn't burn away the confusion in her chest. She had been raised to fight, raised to conquer. She had never imagined being a prisoner. She glanced over at Jace, still sitting by the fire. his gaze lost in thought. For a moment, they simply watched each other. Two soldiers, two survivors, caught in a world that had never been kind to either of them. Finally, Carol broke the silence. "What's your name?" she asked, her voice soft. Jace looked up, surprised. Then, after a long moment, he smiled faintly. "You can call me Jace." "Jace?" Carol repeated under her breath, as if testing the sound of it. He nodded. "And yours?" She hesitated for a moment before answering. "Carol." They both nodded, the exchange simple but significant. Names exchanged like warriors who no longer knew what to do with their pain. And so, there they sat. Not as enemies, not as allies, just survivors. Two souls caught in a moment between destruction and whatever might come next. The night passed in relative silence. The fire was now reduced to embers, glowing faintly in the cold darkness. Carol had never known a night like this. Quiet, and without the ever-present noise of the war. In the distance, the ruins of the battlefield stretched on endlessly, a graveyard of civilizations. But here, beside the small fire, the world felt strangely distant, almost unreal. By the time dawn broke, the sun was a dull shadow in the gray sky. The air was thick with the scent of ash and burnt metal. Carol woke slowly, the weight of exhaustion settling in her bones. She had not slept well, too many questions, too many thoughts spiraling in her mind. She turned her head and saw Jace already moving, his rifle slung over his shoulder as he checked their surroundings. His movements were calm, methodical. The soldier she had once seen as an enemy was now something else. But what was he? "Where are we going?" Carol asked, her voice hoarse. Jace didn't look back at her immediately. He simply walked, his boots crunching softly on the shattered ground. "North side," he said. "There's a tunnel, leads out of the blast zone." Carol's eyes narrowed. "You're helping me," she said, the confusion still evident in her voice. "Why?" Jace paused for a moment, looking out over the desolate landscape. His eyes lingered on the horizon, where the sun struggled to rise, casting a weak light over the destruction. "I don't know," he muttered. "Maybe because I'm tired of following orders. Maybe because I'm tired of killing." He gave a small shrug, his face still unreadable. "Maybe because I remember what it's like to be forgotten." Carol didn't answer. She simply followed, her boots leaving faint marks in the ash. She didn't know if she could trust him, if she could trust anyone anymore. But for some reason, she stayed with him, walking side by side, through the remains of the world they had both once fought to destroy. Hours later. The journey was long, and the quiet was oppressive. Carol's mind kept returning to the battlefield, to the day everything had changed. Her people, her comrades, all gone in an instant. She had been raised to fight, to conquer, to never question the mission. But now, everything felt different. She didn't know what to think anymore. Jace didn't speak much as they moved through the ruins. He checked every corner, every shadow, his eyes constantly scanning their surroundings. There was something in his movements that spoke of experience. He was no stranger to danger. They crossed a broken bridge, its steel beams twisted and warped, and the air grew colder. A strange, eerie stillness hung over the land. The city was a ghost of what it had once been, its streets broken and burned, buildings shattered beyond recognition. Carol's eyes darted around, scanning the broken landscape. She was still on edge, still expecting an attack. It was in her nature to be always alert, always prepared for the worst. But nothing happened. It was just them, walking through the ghostly remains of a forgotten world. They stopped by an old vending station, long abandoned and rusted, its doors caved in from the devastation. Jace pulled something out of the wreckage. 2 energy bars. He handed one to Carol, his gaze meeting hers for a brief moment. "Here," he said, his voice low. "We need to keep moving." Carol took the bar, eyeing it with suspicion. She wasn't hungry. She didn't feel anything, not really. But the simple gesture of giving her something to eat, it confused her. "I don't understand," she muttered, tearing the wrapper open and taking a bite. "Humans don't help people like me." Jace chewed slowly, looking away, his face distant. "I'm not people," he replied softly. Carol frowned, her mind struggling to keep up with everything happening. "Then what are you?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. Jace didn't answer immediately. He just kept walking, his eyes scanning the horizon. "Tired," he said finally. Carol didn't know what to say to that. She had always seen humans as nothing but soldiers, machines built for war, for destruction. But Jace, he wasn't like that. Not entirely. She didn't know who he was or what he wanted, but she couldn't help but wonder. Later, they moved through narrow streets, passing broken statues that had once been monuments to power. Now they were just relics of a forgotten past. Carol's eyes lingered on them for a moment before she turned away, focusing instead on the path ahead. "That child," she said suddenly, her voice catching in the quiet. "You helped him. He wasn't human. Why?" Jace didn't answer right away. His hand was resting on the rifle at his side, his fingers drumming lightly against the grip. When he did speak, his voice was low, almost reflective. "Because I remember what it's like to be forgotten," he said again, as if it were the only reason that mattered. Carol didn't know how to respond to that. She had been raised to see humans as the enemy. Yet, here she was, walking beside one, having shared food with him, having fought beside him. And now, he was helping a wounded child, one of her kind. It didn't make sense. Nothing made sense anymore. By the time they found shelter for the night, the world had turned cold and dark. They stumbled into an old checkpoint building, its walls cracked and covered in dust. It wasn't much, but it would have to do. Jace checked the scanners. No drones, no enemies nearby. "Rest," he said, settling down against one of the walls. "We'll leave at first light." Carol sat down across from him, her body aching from the journey, from the constant tension that never seemed to leave her. Her hands rubbed at her wrists, still sore from the ropes that had bound her. She had never been so close to death, so close to losing everything. But now she wasn't sure what to think. Jace didn't talk much. He leaned his head back, closing his eyes. Carol could hear his breathing, steady but slow, as though the weight of everything was finally catching up with him. She stared at the ground, lost in thought. She had thought she was prepared for this moment, for the end. But now that it was here, she wasn't sure who she was anymore. She wasn't sure who Jace was anymore. As the night wore on, she glanced over at him again. The fire between them crackled softly, the only sound in the quiet room. There was no anger in him, no hatred. Just weariness. She finally spoke again, her voice soft. "You could have left me back there, back when I was tied up, back when you could have just walked away." Jace didn't answer right away. He simply stared at the fire, his face unreadable. "I didn't leave you," he said quietly. "I didn't leave you when the dogs came after you. I stayed." Carol blinked, surprised by his words. There was no pride in his voice, no boast, just truth. And in that moment, Something inside her shifted. Maybe, just maybe, this human wasn't so different from her. The night settled into an uncomfortable silence. Carol lay against the cold stone wall of the ruined checkpoint building, her legs stretched out, staring at the darkened ceiling. She had never been one for rest. Even in the heat of battle, she had always kept moving, always ready for the next strike, the next order. But here, in this broken world, there was nothing but stillness. The very air around her felt heavy with questions she couldn't answer. The war, her people, Jace, all of it swirling together like dust in the wind. She glanced over at Jace, who sat by the fire, his face illuminated by the flickering flames. His rifle was propped against the wall beside him, and his eyes were distant, lost in thought. She had no idea what went through his mind, what kind of soldier he had been, or what had brought him to this moment. But she knew one thing for certain. He wasn't the same as the others. He wasn't like the ones who had killed her comrades, her family. "You're quiet," she said after a long silence, her voice breaking the stillness. Jace didn't look at her immediately. He was still, as if weighing his thoughts carefully. When he did respond, his voice was low, almost unreadable. "I'm not used to being this." He paused, then added, "To being here with you. It feels strange." Carol's brow furrowed, but she said nothing. The fire crackled between them, the only sound breaking the quiet. She didn't know what to say. She wasn't used to anyone talking like this. Human, alien, it didn't matter. It felt vulnerable, unfamiliar. Finally, Jace leaned forward slightly, his elbows resting on his knees. His gaze moved to her, meeting her eyes for the first time since they had set up camp. "You're not the only one who's been trained for war," he said, his voice quiet but firm. "I've followed orders all my life. I've killed when I was told to. I've burned cities, destroyed everything in my path without ever questioning it. But there was a moment I can't forget, when I stopped. When I realized I was nothing but a tool, a weapon. I wasn't even human anymore." Carol looked at him, really looked at him for the first time. She had seen his strength, his skill in battle. But now, she saw something else. A weariness in his eyes, something she could relate to, something raw and real. He wasn't just a soldier. He was a person who had been broken by the very system he had served. "Why did you stop?" she asked, her voice quieter than she intended. Jace exhaled slowly, his gaze falling to the fire. "Because one day, I couldn't pull the trigger. I couldn't do it anymore. They called me a traitor for refusing to follow the orders." He chuckled bitterly, shaking his head. "I was thrown away like a broken tool, no questions, no explanations, just discarded." Sir Carol sat up slightly, her body tense as she absorbed his words. She knew what it was like to be a tool, to be used and discarded by her people. Her hands subconsciously rubbed the scar on her arm, a constant reminder of the moment she had refused a command, her own captain's orders to kill a human child. She hadn't done it. And for that, she had been hunted, left behind. "You're not the only one," she said softly, her voice rough with memories. She pulled back her sleeve, revealing the deep scar that ran from her shoulder down to her chest. "This wasn't from a battle," she said. "It was from my own captain. He tried to kill me because I wouldn't obey him." Jace's eyes met hers, and for a moment there was an understanding between them. Two souls who had once been part of a war they didn't choose, now caught in the aftermath. He leaned forward, his expression somber but not cold. "We're not so different," he said quietly. Maybe we never were. Carol looked away, her gaze drifting to the floor. The thought weighed on her, pulling her under like a tide she couldn't fight. Could it be true? Could they really be the same? She had always been taught to hate humans, to see them as nothing but the enemy. And yet here she was, sitting with one, sharing a fire, sharing stories. She took a deep breath, trying to clear her mind. "What now?" she asked, her voice almost a whisper. Jace didn't answer immediately. He stared at the fire, his face lit by the orange glow. He seemed to be considering the question, weighing it against all the things that had come before. "We move forward," he said finally, his voice steady. "We survive." Carol nodded, though she wasn't sure if she believed it. Surviving wasn't enough. Not anymore. But what other choice did she have? Later that night, the wind howled outside, rattling the broken windows of the checkpoint building. Inside, Carol sat with her back to the wall, her eyes closed as she tried to find some semblance of sleep. But sleep wouldn't come. Her thoughts were too loud, too chaotic. The war, her people, the human who had spared her life. What was this? What was happening between them? She shifted on the cold floor, trying to find a comfortable position. But the thoughts kept coming, relentless and overwhelming. There were so many things she didn't understand, so many things she was afraid to face. But there was one thing she knew for certain. She wasn't alone. She opened her eyes and glanced over at Jace. He had fallen asleep by the fire, his back against the wall. The faint light from the dying flames danced across his face, casting shadows that made him look human. He was no longer just an enemy soldier. He was something more, something that made her question everything she had believed. Carol exhaled slowly, the weight of it all sinking in. She wasn't just surviving anymore, she was changing. But she didn't know if that change would be enough. The next morning, the first light of dawn broke through the cracks in the ruined building. The world outside was still, and the remnants of war seemed to stretch on forever. Jace stirred beside the fire, waking with the first signs of daylight. He didn't move right away, but Carol could see the tension in his shoulders, the weariness that never seemed to leave him. She stood up, her legs stiff from the night on the cold ground. They were about to leave, about to continue their journey north. But she wasn't sure what awaited them. She wasn't sure if she even cared anymore. Jace stood, brushing dust off his clothes and slinging his rifle over his shoulder. He gave her a quick glance, his expression unreadable. "You ready?" he asked, his voice low but steady. Carol nodded, though she wasn't sure what she was ready for. "Let's go." Together they walked out of the checkpoint and into the wasteland beyond. The world was still broken, still scarred by war. But with each step, Carol felt a little lighter, a little less burdened by the past. Maybe, just maybe, they could make it out of this alive. Not as enemies, not as soldiers, but as something else. Something that neither of them had expected. The silence of the canyon stretched out in front of them, broken only by the soft crunch of their boots against the uneven ground. Carol's eyes scanned the desolate landscape as they moved forward, the jagged rocks towering around them like silent sentinels. The wind was biting, and the air felt sharp, carrying the faint scent of rust and dust. Everything here was dead, everything burned away by the war. "We're close," Jace said quietly, his voice barely rising above the wind. He glanced around, scanning the high ridges of the canyon. "Keep alert." Carol didn't need to be told. She could feel the tension in the air, a quiet hum that set her nerves on edge. It had been days since they had seen any sign of life other than each other. But this place, the ashlands, was far from safe. The ground beneath them seemed to resist their steps, as if the very earth wanted to forget them. "How much further?" she asked, her voice sharp. Jace didn't look at her, his eyes still scanning the landscape. "Not far. The tunnel's close." They crossed the jagged canyon floor, the walls rising higher on either side. The ground was littered with the remnants of past battles, burnt-out shells of vehicles, old weapons half buried in the ash. The world here felt abandoned, forgotten. No one came to this place, not unless they were desperate. They had to be desperate. As they moved deeper into the canyon, a low, guttural growl echoed in the distance. Carol froze, her muscles tensing, every sense on high alert. She glanced at Jace, who had already reached for his rifle, his eyes narrowing. "What was that?" she whispered, her heart pounding in her chest. Jace didn't answer immediately. He just motioned for her to stay back, then stepped forward cautiously, his rifle raised. Carol followed, her hand on the short blade she had taken from the wreckage days ago, still untested, still unfamiliar in her grip. The growl came again, closer now. It sounded like an animal, but something deeper, something unnatural. Carol's breath caught in her throat as she realized they weren't alone. "Get ready," Jace muttered under his breath. "It's the bone dogs." Carol's eyes widened. Bone dogs were mechanical predators, designed by the Varani to clean the battlefield. They were relentless, programmed to hunt down the dead, the wounded. But these weren't ordinary machines. No, these were the kind of beasts that didn't follow orders. They were predators, pure and simple. Her eyes darted around, searching for any sign of movement, but the canyon was eerily still. Then, from the shadows, they came. The first one emerged from behind a pile of wreckage, its metallic body glistening in the dim light, sharp claws scraping against the stone. Its eyes glowed a cold blue, scanning the canyon floor as it slowly advanced. Carol instinctively stepped back, her grip tightening on her weapon. Jace raised his rifle. "Stay back," he warned. "Let me handle this." Before Carol could respond, the bone dog let out a sharp howl, its mechanical form lunging toward them with terrifying speed. Jace fired, the blast hitting the beast square in the chest. It staggered, sparks flying, but it didn't fall. Carol acted without thinking. She dove forward, rolling beneath the dog's snap of teeth. As she came up behind it, she kicked out with a swift strike, knocking the dog off balance. The thing growled again, its joints grinding as it attempted to regain its footing. Jace was already moving, firing again, his shots hitting the creature's legs, tearing into the mechanical structure. With a screech, the bone dog collapsed, its body twitching and sparking, finally lying still. Carol stood, her chest heaving. The adrenaline was still pulsing through her veins, but the threat was far from over. They had more to deal with. Behind them, another bone dog appeared, followed by two more. They were closing in fast. "Move!" Jace shouted, grabbing Carol's arm and pulling her forward. They ran, ducking behind the crumbling walls of a nearby structure as plasma fire ripped through the air, narrowly missing them. Carol's heart was in her throat as they scrambled for cover. Jace fired a few more rounds, taking down another of the mechanical beasts, but the others kept coming. "They don't stop," Jace muttered, reloading quickly. "They won't stop until we're dead." The bone dogs were relentless, each one a terrifying fusion of machinery and hunting instinct. Carol's eyes darted back and forth as she looked for an escape route. They couldn't keep fighting forever. "We need to get higher," she said quickly. "If we can get to that old relay tower, we might have a chance." Jace nodded. "On me." They broke cover and sprinted toward the tower, their feet pounding against the rocky ground. The bone dogs followed, their growls growing louder with every step. Carol could hear them behind her, feel their presence closing in. They reached the base of the tower, and Jace quickly began to climb, his movements fluid and practiced. Carol followed, but her eyes kept darting over her shoulder, watching for the bone dogs. They were close now. As Carol climbed, she could hear the bone dogs leaping up the rocks behind them, their claws scraping against the stone. Her heart was pounding, but she forced herself to focus. They had to make it to the top. "Almost there," Jace called, his voice strained. "Keep moving." Carol reached the top of the tower, her hands gripping the edge as she pulled herself over. Jace was already there, setting up his rifle to cover her. But it wasn't over. The bone dogs were still coming. "We can't stay here for long," Jace said, scanning the canyon below. "We'll overload the tower's core, use it as an EMP. It'll fry their circuits, but we need to hold them off until then." Carol nodded, understanding. They didn't have much time. With a grim look, Jace moved to the control panel, his fingers working quickly to activate the overload. Carol kept watch, her eyes narrowed as the bone dogs closed in on their position. They had to hold the line. The hum of the EMP tower filled the air, the steady pulse vibrating through the ground beneath their feet. Carol kept her eyes on the horizon, scanning for any signs of the bone dogs, while Jace worked furiously at the control panel. The sound of mechanical growls echoed through the canyon, followed by the sharp clatter of claws on rock. The bone dogs were closing in, relentless in their pursuit. "How long until this thing overloads?" Carol shouted over the noise, her pulse racing as she turned to face the oncoming threat. Jace didn't look up from the panel, his fingers moving quickly as he input commands. 30 seconds, he replied, his voice tight with concentration. "We need to hold them off just a little longer." The bone dogs were almost on them now. Carol's grip tightened on her weapon. They had no choice but to fight. She glanced at Jace, his face hard with determination, and then back at the machines closing in. They were like shadows in the dim light, their glowing blue eyes locked onto their prey. One of the dogs leaped forward, its sharp metallic teeth glinting in the faint light. Jace fired first, hitting the beast square in the chest. The dog staggered back, sparks flying from its shattered form, but it didn't stop. The other bone dogs followed, relentless, and one of them barreled toward Carol with terrifying speed. She barely had time to react, diving to the side as the bone dog lunged at her. It missed, but only just, its claws scraping across her side, leaving a deep, painful scratch. She gritted her teeth, ignoring the pain as she twisted around and drove her short blade into the dog's exposed joint. The machine howled, its metallic body jerking before it collapsed, twitching and sparking. "Keep moving!" Jace yelled, firing at another dog that had closed in on his position. "We're almost there!" Carol scrambled back to her feet, her eyes scanning the area for any signs of the remaining bone dogs. They were closing in too fast, and the EMP tower wasn't going to overload in time. She had to think, had to act fast. "There's too many of them!" Carol shouted, her voice strained. She swung her blade, knocking back another bone dog that lunged at her from the side. "Just hold them off!" Jace shouted back, his voice filled with urgency. "We're almost—" A loud crack split the air, and Carol's heart skipped a beat. The EMP tower's core had overloaded. A flash of blue light erupted from the tower, sending a shockwave through the canyon. The pulse of energy radiated outward, and for a split second, everything seemed to freeze. The bone dogs, mid-pounce, froze in place. Their glowing blue eyes flickered once, twice, and then went dark. They collapsed to the ground, their bodies stiff and lifeless, scattered like broken statues. The once menacing predators were now nothing more than husks of twisted metal and circuitry. Carol stood still, staring at the fallen machines. She could hear her breath, ragged and uneven, her pulse pounding in her ears. The immediate danger had passed, but the relief felt distant. There was still so much uncertainty, so much fear. Jace lowered his rifle, his expression a mix of exhaustion and triumph. He turned to Carol, his eyes searching hers for some sign of what was next. "We did it," he said quietly, his voice tinged with relief. Carol didn't respond right away. She still couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. The tower had worked, yes, but she couldn't shake the feeling that their fight was far from over. They weren't safe yet. "We need to move," Carol said, her voice steady despite the pounding in her chest. "The signal's out. They'll know we're here." Jace nodded, wiping the sweat from his brow. "You're right. We don't have much time." As they turned to leave, Carol's eyes lingered on the dead bone dogs. The machines that had once been the perfect weapons, the perfect hunters, were now nothing more than scrap. And for the first time she realized something. They had survived, not because they were stronger or because they were faster, but because they had worked together. They had trusted each other. But even as she thought that, she couldn't shake the feeling that something was still watching them. The EMP had taken down the bone dogs, but it didn't erase the greater threat that loomed over them. Hours later, they made their way through the canyon, their pace so but steady. The echoes of their footsteps seemed to reverberate through the narrow walls, a constant reminder of the emptiness around them. The world still felt like a ghost town, ruined, abandoned, and broken. But Carol felt a change inside her, something she couldn't quite name. It wasn't peace, but it was something close. She didn't feel alone anymore. Jace kept glancing at her as they walked, his face unreadable. But there was something there, a hint of recognition, of understanding. They had both been survivors of the war, of destruction, but they had made it through this together. "Why did you trust me?" Jace asked suddenly, his voice breaking the silence. "After everything, why did you trust me?" Carol didn't hesitate. She knew the answer now. "Because you didn't kill me. Because you gave me a chance when no one else would." Jace stopped walking, turning to face her. There was something in his eyes, a softness, a vulnerability she hadn't seen before. "I didn't kill you because I see something in you, something that reminds me of myself. We're both stuck in this world, caught between what we were and what we're becoming." Carol stood still, her heart beating in her chest. "So what now?" she asked, her voice quiet but steady. "What happens next?" Jace smiled, a small, weary smile. "We survive. Together." And for the first time in a long time, Carol believed it. They weren't enemies anymore. They weren't even survivors anymore. They were something more. Something that couldn't be defined by war or fear. They were something human. Something real. A few hours later, the sun had started to set, casting long shadows across the barren landscape. Carol and Jace made their way up a small ridge, their bodies aching from the long journey, but their spirits buoyed by the small victory they had shared. The world ahead of them was still full of uncertainty, but at least they were no longer alone. Carol glanced at Jace, her heart a little lighter than it had been just a few hours ago. She didn't know what the future held, but for the first time, she didn't feel so afraid of it. The air was cold, but as they walked, it felt a little less oppressive. They were still standing on the edge of war, but somehow, together, they had found something else, a reason to keep going. And that, Carol realized, was enough.